This ends really a terrific week of a lot of great presenters, and I want to thank Epson and Photo Shelter and Archive Magazine, American Photography, Pro Photo Daily, and tonight we have our friend Maranie Staab, who is out of Oregon tonight, and so it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon for her, and we'll let you share the screen, and it's all yours, dear.
Right. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to make this full screen in just a second, but I wanted to say that you might have all seen a lot of presentations so far. So in the spirit of making it interesting for all of you, if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat box. I want to, be as provide as much information as I can. But I am going to, so my name is Maranie. I'm a freelance photographer, videographer, drone pilot, currently based in Portland, Oregon. And last year, about 10 days after the war started, I'd been thinking about going for a while. It kicked off. They immediately closed the airspace. And so I had to pivot, and I decided to fly into, I wanted to go to Moldova because most of the images, are you seeing a green box? Oh,
No, not anymore. Now you're
working?
full screen. I was going to tell you that. Now you're full screen. You're perfect. But yeah.
Okay.
But now we see something on the it's coming back and forth with your sound system there, and now it's gone. Now it's there.
I think I shared it correctly. I'm very sorry, guys. Hold on one second. I pushed what, is this okay or not?
I mean, we're fine, but on the right side,
There.
Now you're perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. So how I ended up over there was I decided to go to Moldova. Most of the images a lot of us were seeing initially were at the Polish border because that's where the largest exodus of people were going. But I read a statistic where the highest number of people per capita were actually going to Moldova, which is a very small, very poor country. So I was interested in going there because there was less information coming out. And yeah, primarily for this reason. So this is an image I made the first night, and I ended up staying. I was very fortunate in that I stayed in a home that doubled it was a hostel that doubled as a place that was taking in Ukrainian refugees. And this is a mother and her children, and they had just fled across the border that first night. And I just shared this because upon arrival, I immediately tried to start getting my bearings, and I went down to the basement and was talking to this mother and her children through using Google Translator. And she had left her husband behind and her father. And yeah. So these first series of images are from March of last year at the Ukrainian Moldovan border, and it was freezing cold at that time. And this is still in the initial exodus of people. So I'm just going to run through some of these images to give you an idea. Again, we had millions of people fleeing across the border, across into seven different countries.
And how long were you there for the first time?
So I was, the first trip was 2 months. So, and there's a series of things that I did and places I went during that first trip. But the first several weeks I was based out of Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova. And I would travel to the border either on my own or with a driver or with an aid group. And they would be doing, providing either transportation or food or something else. And again, I've covered different refugee crises over the years, but one of the things that made this one different was almost exclusively women and children, because men 18, I believe through 60, 65, I did know at one point, but they were required to stay, with the exception of there was like 4 4 exceptions that would allow men to also leave. But this was disproportionately women and children we were seeing. And so, I mean, it was chaos, and it was desperation. And unfortunately, similar scenes we've seen in other refugee crises. But again, primarily women and children. And so they would show up at the border, and at the beginning there was a scramble. It wasn't as coordinated as it is now, or even several months later. So people would arrive at the border and they'd just be standing around, and then Moldovan citizens, Moldovan aid groups, just people wanting to help, would go to the border and pick up Ukrainian refugees and bring them back to their homes or to different refugee shelters that were sprouting up throughout Chisinau. This woman is speaking to someone trying to figure out where she's going to go. They fled danger, and then they got to the border, and now it was very much a question of now what.
Yeah, and was it organized at the border, from the Moldavians? Did they have a system set up?
It was pretty impressive, and I was I was there within the first 2 weeks. Mostly, from what I could tell, mostly volunteers and smaller aid groups, but they had I guess this would be a perfect example. They even had little areas for children to play in. This was a little shelter, or a little tent rather, where the kids could play, where the parents tried to figure out what was happening. And then there was people had food, and it was freezing cold, so they had places where people could get coffee and stuff. And then there were large buses that would transport people to various cities. Most went to Chisinau, which again is the capital of Moldova, and then from there they'd either stay there or they would continue on. That kind of gives you an idea of just a little bit of everything happening. I was with a very small aid organization, someone I met just by chance, and this is on the bus back to Chisinau. And a lot of these are single images. I like spending more I ended up spending time with one of these families for quite some time, but I wanted to, with this whole presentation, I guess, provide an overview. So again, this is on a bus ride back to Chisinau from, it's called the Palanca border crossing. Pre-war, there were numerous ways to cross any of the borders, but when the war started, they closed a lot of the borders, and the Palanca border crossing was one that remained open. About 2 hours from Chisinau. This is at the border. So at the border, depending upon how long the line was, I spent so many hours in buses and or just standing around with people, because at the border, documents would be checked. First of all, there was a huge line, huge queue, and then documents would be checked before anybody could pass either way. That kind of gives you an idea. Again, this was in March, and this is, I wish I had my drone for this shot, because this was a 7-hour line, and that is not even the worst that you'll hear, or the longest you'll hear. But this is people leaving Ukraine, and you can clearly see that no one's coming in. But I was on my second trip, it was summer, and there were no longer these kinds of lines. That initial exodus had really ceased. People were still leaving, but just as many people had started to come back. And at the border, again, you would just have a lot of people kind of just waiting in a type of limbo. You'll see a lot of women and children. So it's an ongoing subject matter that I'm interested in, especially with displacement. A lot of these women were on their own to kind of figure out, what next.
So during the course of this day or these days, there's got to be a point for you of no return. Where am I sleeping tonight? At some point, you're vulnerable as well. You're on this bus. Where are you going when you get there?
Well, in some instances, so I was based out of Chisinau, so I had a room at this, it was a one, it's like a very mini story, but I actually flew into Romania and I met somebody on a bus in Romania who worked for a very small Dutch NGO who hooked me up with this small like guest house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they just let me like have a bed there for a while. And it's also the place that was housing refugees. So I did have a quasi home base.
Okay.
But in other places I've worked throughout the world, like something to, one way I think about it is like all of these individuals are going to find a place to sleep. I'm sure I will find a place to sleep. It's not really a concern necessarily. Like I'm among other people trying to figure the same thing out.
Right.
Slept in some, when you're tired, you find places to sleep. So, so this just very briefly, this is kind of gives you an idea of what, people trying, this was in Nikolaev, which is in southern Ukraine, and this gives you an idea of just people would show up at predetermined, either it was a parking lot or, you know, just an intersection. And in this instance, I was with a group doing evacuations, and women and children, primarily again, with 1 or 2 bags, would show up and try to get on these buses. And sometimes there was enough room for everyone, and sometimes there wasn't. Husbands would often be there to say goodbye. This is a military man who had brought his wife and children to see them off. Waving goodbye out of the bus. And so this next series of photos is kind of under the umbrella of like being displaced. So this is back in Chisinau, where, so what happens after people leave Ukraine? And this is a shelter that was set up in an old sports arena, and it was actually primarily for Romas or Gypsies. And what was happening initially until things got a bit more organized were, like, for example, this is an old sports arena or old warehouses, or there were many different like smaller buildings. But if you had lots of churches, a lot of church basements, people were just, you know, private residents were giving their extra bedrooms. That is another common theme where just people were very hospitable. Again, Moldova is very small and very poor, but what I witnessed was like this rallying to help Ukrainians. This is just I like details like this where this was in a shelter and just like the kids, you know, still trying to be kids to some degree. The little stick figures holding hearts. And this is another shelter that welcomed pets, which I spent some time in. I was with a lot of people covering, and I will get stuff that's closer to like the front line, but I'm very interested in like the periphery of what's happening. So like what happens after people cross the border, or I guess trying to seek out, just especially when you have, I know several of the people you've had on have talked about just how well covered this war is, and that's incredibly important. So trying to find something that maybe perhaps hasn't been covered as well. So I did some work with World Central Kitchen, which was all about like, so now you have millions of people that have been displaced from Ukraine. So how do you feed them? So I spent time with different kitchens throughout Chisinau who were doing these heroic efforts to now feed quite literally millions of people that had flooded. Well, in Chisinau, just, it was, I think, like 150,000 people, but still it's an influx of people that don't have their own means to do pretty much anything. So it was this like, okay, so now where do they sleep? How do they feed themselves? How do they get medical care? All of these details.
And also from a practical side, you know, you've got to be focused on making sure all your equipment is charged all the time with, you know, with all these different, practical issues as well, right? I mean, as you're going through this for days on end, right? I mean, that's another concern.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a concern, just something that like to be hyper aware of, like
Right.
no matter how tired I am, images get uploaded, batteries go onto the charger. Ideally, images get backed up, but it becomes yeah, there's a degree of discipline for sure in addition to other things. You only have to run out of batteries once to learn that mistake. So this is I do have extended captions for all of these. I do I also write, but we don't quite have time to go through all of them. Lisa and Lena, mother and daughter. This was on a bus. Anna and her son. This is in a basement shelter in Chisinau. As you can see, broke her arm when their house was hit by a missile. And a handful of these individuals I was able to keep up with. Like she and her son made it to Germany, and she has since received like more advanced medical care. So that's a good ending to that particular story. So again, like one thing, like, so what happens to the elderly? And so this woman, she was in her mid 80s and she had been living alone, and her family, she had a daughter who was abroad in Germany, and her daughter, for whatever reason, wasn't able to travel back. So there was a monastery that had basically taken in exclusively the elderly population. So this woman, had been displaced within Ukraine. So she'd been internally displaced from her home to this monastery in Ukraine. This is Aliona, who I actually still keep in touch with. This was on a bus, and I'll never forget her quote. She said, "This time last week, I was shopping for my prom dress, and now I'm sitting here on this bus talking to you." So it's always, I'm always like, it's seeking a relatability aspect, especially when doing any sort of international work. So I think a lot of people can relate to, shopping for a prom dress or something along those lines. This is a group called Clowns Without Borders that they did. They came into these different shelters, and they were clowns working with children, and they provided medical care as well as just entertainment. And specifically, they focused on like mental health. And this was in a donation center in Odessa, Ukraine, that had clothing and just different resources for Ukrainians that had been displaced.
What all these images illustrate is like the good naturedness of people to help other people is really, without that, this as bad as it is, it could be so much worse. These people had some type of a place to go to, and the goodness of strangers, really amazing.
No, I agree. And people have asked me something along the lines of like, isn't this difficult? But you will also see the best of humanity in these situations. Yeah. When you're pushed to a brink that or some sort of to the brink, to the edge in a way that doesn't exist in a normal, comfortable society. It brings out the best and the worst in people. So I mean, it's beautiful to be around, to be frank. And this is again late night food distribution.
Yeah, even your images at the bus stops, at the train station. There isn't that I got to be ahead of somebody else. It always appears that people are measured in their anxiety and their need to get on that train, to get on that bus. It doesn't feel so chaotic like we've seen in other situations where people are hungry and there's a frenzy to it. This seems like a quiet sort of, we'll get through this sort of an attitude. So it's really intriguing.
It's a good observation. This is a series I put together called The Road to Chernihiv. I think you've had other photographers come on that talked about Chernihiv, which was one of many cities occupied by Russians and almost completely flattened. I I mentioned to Frank before we all got on that I didn't do a lot of work for wires or anything, so I was able to pursue some projects or some stories on my own. And this particular story was about a man named Salam Al-Din and his organization Team Humanity. And he has been doing he has worked all around the world doing different humanitarian projects. And in this this series of photos, I joined him on an evacuation mission from Kishinev to Chernihiv, which is in the northeastern part of Ukraine. So it was going to be a several 100 miles on a bus to deliver medical supplies and to evacuate people from this besieged city.
So a situation like that comes up. What's your decision-making process? I should do this and not go here. You know, I mean, a couple 100-mile, bus ride, that's a long day. It's a long, experience. And how do you know, like, what in your gut tells you this is going to be, visually captivating and intriguing?
I think you just said it a little bit, like your gut, in the sense that I had established some rapport with Salam. I had seen his work. I had a degree of trust. We were able to talk through the plan a little bit, do a little bit of risk assessment. And at that point, I was still based out of Chisinau in Moldova. So I was taking every opportunity I could to go into Ukraine. So a combination of things. And to me, this was very interesting because we were there. It was either 2 or 3 days after Chernihiv was liberated. So we were going to be able to be there like right as the civilians were. It was 40 days that Chernihiv was under siege. So a lot of reasons just played into it. And also just, if since I'm largely like orchestrating what I'm doing myself on the ground, it was the best opportunity to tell what I thought would be an important story at the time. So this is like 4 or 5 in the morning, loading diapers and water and a bunch of other medical supplies. And this is Salam putting, some of you might remember the Mariupol theater that was bombed where several hundred people were killed. This says children, and he's putting this on the top of our bus. This was just like a moment of like, this is real. So this in theory is to deter Russians from bombing this bus while we're on it, saying that there's children inside.
And at this point, the whole COVID issue is out the window.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, but it's certainly not front of mind anymore. Just like I covered the 2020 racial justice protest pretty extensively, and that quickly became secondary concern. I think it's just more of a I still had to have a COVID vaccination to travel and everything, but very few people were worried about it on the ground.
Yeah.
I'm just going to run through these just to give you an idea of what it took to get from Chisinau to Chernihiv. So these are roadblocks.
And what's the distance again?
I would have to look it up, but actually I could just do that really quickly.
No, that's fine. Like how many hours in the bus,
Well, we made it, it was more than 20 hours, put it that way. Yeah. And that's the distance, but also because of things like this.
Right.
Between Chisinau and Chernihiv, we passed through at least 50 different like roadblocks and checkpoints. The closer we got, the more stops had to be made. And then this is the center of Chernihiv. So this is just, there's nothing left. So a lot of people had fled prior to the Russian forces invading, but a lot of people didn't make it out in time and or decided to kind of risk it. And these women, again, it had just been liberated and they were now trying to get out because there was nothing left. We spent some time at a hospital. The people we met, it's pretty horrific. Yeah, this is one more destruction. Let me just segue into that. only because I did what I did. So like, this is an example of one of the patients we met. His name is Bogdan, and he had been, why does he keep doing that? Bogdan is 13, and he and his father were at home when a missile hit their home, and he is in some sort of state of shock at this point. And what we were told that he didn't yet know at the time was that his father didn't survive. So, and what the situation at this hospital at the time was, everyone was in the basement. And a lot of the patients had been evacuated prior to Russia's invasion, but there was about 15 plus or minus, primarily children, still in this. And the nurses told us stories of how, like, they went at one point like 2 weeks without food and water because the bombardment was so bad. And almost all of the children were in different states like this. So again, on the way to Chernihiv, heavy military presence, and then a lot of destruction. Like this bridge was blown out. We actually had been in a huge bus, but we had to change vehicles to like a smaller van in order to be able to cross over what they'd made like this makeshift bridge. And this was a first for me. Still active landmines. There are many types of landmines, but these are like the large ones that are meant to, if vehicles were to go over this, they would explode. They were old Russian, old Soviet landmines. They're also the small ones, which when you hear about like people losing limbs or their lives, it's usually the smaller ones they're stepping on. Like, I wasn't about to test this, but in theory, like just human weight couldn't set that off. But and I think you've heard other photographers talk about like this Russians, if they were fleeing or leaving a village or a city, they'd often leave this and other types of mines or other things left to continue to cause harm and damage and death. These are Ukrainian tanks, again, just right after the liberation of this city. We're delivering medical supplies here. It's just, there was a huge lack of, I think, something we don't always think about is just how when a country's at war, they're not getting a lot of like just basic necessities. And we've heard a lot about like the grain crisis and just like the food shortages, but there was medicine's been a huge problem, quite like just medical supplies like you see in this picture. Diapers is a huge one that like people could survive without those, but there was a huge demand for that from all the mothers. Just things that I don't want to say we take for granted, but we can certainly get without second thought in normal situations. This is Salam. I think this was after the hospital. The situation with the children was really rough. A lot of them weren't going to survive, and a lot of them looked like Bogdan or worse. This is another checkpoint right before Chernihiv. I don't know if other people have mentioned this during your presentations, but Ukrainians have a very dry sense of humor. And so you'd see these types of signs everywhere. And then that's a Soviet tank destroyed. And then to me, this just like speaks to, daily life continuing on in spite and despite like the horrors of war, really. This is a series of images about like life amidst war. So it's trying to show just the different ways people continue to go about their daily life on the backdrop of war. This is in Kharkiv. Again, in Kharkiv. This is during my second trip, where I spent almost my entire time in Kharkiv and or the surrounding villages. Kharkiv is very close to the Russian border, about 30 miles plus or minus. And there were, as opposed to my first trip where I wasn't really, well, with the exception of Chernihiv, but Kharkiv was being bombed all day and all night. but it's a big city, and the strikes were, I do want to say random or targeted. So you would have people like that woman walking, and then a mile away, like at my hotel, there was a missile that struck a mile from my hotel and a bunch of people were killed, but there was no way to necessarily predict that. So it was like an inherent element of risk. In Kharkiv, whereas in Lviv or Kyiv, daily life was largely continuing on, a lot of people were still living underground in the villages surrounding Kharkiv. So this man had been underground for several months at this point.
And when did you go back the second time?
So I was there for early March through early May, and then I came back. As I told Frank earlier, I had to photograph a wedding because that often helps pay for plane tickets. And I went back mid-June through mid-July. So,
Okay,
yeah.
July. Okay.
So this gives you an idea of like, this is a very common scene where like people were living underground. The shelling was so dangerous day and night, where people would spend the majority of their time underground. They'd maybe go out for groceries, but bread lines were often targeted. And it was just very, very dangerous, especially in the villages outside Kharkiv, because they were very close. It was very close to the Russian border. These are just scenes from like how these individuals had, this man's, one of the luxuries of like not working necessarily, like I could spend time with individuals, and this man's story is rather horrific. The abbreviated version is he and his family were trying to escape the village they were currently in outside of Kharkiv, but they were stopped. And a mine or a missile hit their car and it exploded, and they survived. But he told about watching the families in front of him in the vehicles and the families behind them. They were all executed. He and his wife and his children survived, but they were all, maimed, similar to this.
So all those marks are shrapnel pieces?
I don't want to say specifically, but they're from,
Right.
yes, something along those lines. Yeah. Children, on their computer, just like a very like normal-ish, except, he's underground in a basement, and he has been for months. The disruption of education is something I'll touch on pretty quickly, since these things, time passes quickly, but, oops. Let me keep going. Again, just more images of how people are underground. People are still living underground, especially outside of Kharkiv, because the situation has not changed drastically there. And again, I like juxtapositions. So this is in Kharkiv again, where half the city is in rubble, some of it's boarded up, and yet we have people going to attend some type of formal. It's
Where
kind of like
going? My God, where could they be?
I mean,
Beautiful.
it's beautiful. It's beautiful defiance.
Yeah.
This image in Nikolaev, which is it's a southeastern port city, there was a water shortage. A Russian landmine, or a Russian missile rather, hit the water supply. So in addition to being under siege, there was no running water for more than 2 months. So while I was there, even I was staying at a hotel, there was no running water. So everybody was buying and or filling water jugs, which is, again, it's a burden, but it's also incredibly dangerous to be standing out in line for water in a city that is under siege. This is Anna. She rescued dogs and animals, and there's a lot of people doing this. Again, just something that, it certainly has been talked about, but when families fled, they often weren't able to take their pets, and or a lot of animals were abandoned along the way for any number of reasons. So she goes into villages that were recently liberated or under siege and rescues animals, and tries to get them adopted back out. This is Sardor, and he was one of many like heroes in a small village. He spent every day cooking at this outdoor kitchen. You can kind of see two of his big vats, and he would cook several hundred meals a day. He was working for World Central Kitchen. Went to this village to document. They were essentially sponsoring his efforts. Delightful human. He dedicated his life to feeding people and to nourishing people. And I got back, and he was killed 2 weeks after I met him in a missile strike while delivering food. And this is I actually don't know how to pronounce it, but Glib. He had just graduated high school or college rather, and he was at a resort beach town outside of Odessa with some of his friends celebrating. And the resort beach town, the resort they were staying in was hit. He was among the most fortunate. 9 people died in this particular attack, but he and his 2 friends survived. And he wants to work in a marina someday. And he said he looks forward to dancing when he gets back on his feet, was what he told us. This is just another example of a shelter. Again, life amidst war, just, this is a real missile that had hit in the street and people had just left it there, and this gentleman's like just daily life. This is a site where several civilians were killed. It was just like an aftermath picture of this is a bridge. They were walking across the bridge, just wrong place, wrong time. And that was the story of a lot of civilian deaths in Kharkiv, at least. It would be someone's home or the wrong street corner or a hotel. It's been proven at this point that Russia has been and continues to target civilian infrastructure. This is a man's home and his neighbors helping clean up after it had been struck. And then this is Odessa. That's a rather famous, the Odessa Opera House. And you can see that there are barricades and sandbags. And in the midst of this woman is, just out walking her child or her grandchild. There's 2 more quick series. This is like what I consider like the other front line, like the war on education, where my second time I was there, I was doing work for the World Bank as part of a needs assessment for reconstruction efforts. And so I was spending a lot of my time photographing schools and hospitals and just widespread damage to Kharkiv, as well as interviewing people, school administrators or civilians who had somehow been impacted. So something like 2,500 schools and or educational facilities, and this was at the time last year, had been damaged or destroyed. And so there's been this is all pulled from one school. There's been talk about like a lost generation, but the real point on my takeaway was just, even if the war ends tomorrow, which it won't, unfortunately, the lasting effects, especially on things like education, are still something we don't fully comprehend. But just to see, quite some of the schools looked like they had just like people's notebooks were still there. It looks like people had just left in the middle of class and fled. And then I'm going to run through this last series. These are all drone shots. This is like aftermath imagery, and the perspective that having a drone provides is fun, but in this case, it was very valuable just to show the scope of the damage. So this is again a school. This is a Polytechnic Institute in Kharkiv. Again, another school.
And you learned as you went with the drone? Was that something new for you?
New-ish. I knew enough to, I just got it a few months prior. It wasn't my first time using it. But perhaps something that hasn't been discussed much is just in order to be permitted to use a drone in Kharkiv or in certain areas anywhere near military operations it was quite a process. So I had a PIO or public information officer from the military with me at all times, which is kind of standard, but it wasn't this war is in large part a drone war on both sides, whether it's using it for weaponry, but also for just like reconnaissance. So it isn't advisable to be, I wouldn't want to interfere in any way, but I could also get in a lot of trouble. So just trying to find different ways to visually depict some of the damage. And again, like juxtapositions, this soccer field that had been hit by some sort of missile, and then this man was out there doing yoga. This neighborhood is Seltivka, which is this was where the war started, just outside of this neighborhood. Like North Seltivka is a suburb, it's like part of Kharkiv, and it is it's the most heavily damaged area of Kharkiv. And because again, its proximity to Russia's border, it continues to be one of the most dangerous places. It was almost completely, it was a ghost town. Like if you were in central Kharkiv, you would see people, there were grocery stores open. You could tell things weren't like normal. But if you drove up into this part of Kharkiv, it was like it was a ghost town.
Yeah,
this is where you might have seen, good.
Yeah, so these people are underground in shelters, or they've left?
So there was a mass exodus in April of last year when we were seeing pictures of people living in underground subway stations. That was Kharkiv. I mean, that was a lot of places. At that time, it was primarily Kharkiv, because Russian troops quite literally showed up one day, drove tanks through the town and just destroyed everything. And people were in the underground shelters. Now here, as well as in, there was an initial mass exodus of people that largely had the means to get out quickly. And then since then we've seen some people have decided to quote, like take the risk of staying because it's their home, and being displaced is in a lot of ways it is very difficult. So I guess what I'm saying is like a lot of these people had either moved to another part of Ukraine, or were living in a shelter, or had fled abroad. Some people, like we've heard a lot about, like quote, like refugees, which are people that have left Ukraine, but a lot of Ukrainians also were internally displaced, so they perhaps just went to a western part of the country. I think that might be the last one. Oh no, and that's my PIO and me and Artem, which is someone, he was my driver and fixer and very good friend now. The man would wear flip-flops into the most precarious of areas. He was a taxi, again, like the individual stories are what I love. He was a taxi driver. And when the war started, he started a collective of taxi drivers, and because they no longer had like people with normal needs of transportation, I talked to him as recently as last week. They essentially have dedicated their time and energy to transporting doctors, to delivering meals, to medication. They are one of, like, a lot of Ukrainians, like the question I feel like a lot of Ukrainians ask those who decided to stay is like, what can I do to contribute? And so he did what he knew how. Drove.
To do something.
Yeah. So I think that's all I had. And
I have to tell you that we've seen a lot of presentations, and two things come to mind. One, there's not a single image that you showed that I've seen before.
oh,
Which which is really amazing. You know, and you've shed light on these other stories that, you know, it's sort of like a day in the life of just the regular folks. It's very, very compelling, and you're a great storyteller. Really, really wonderful. You did a great job. So we could open up. Anyone has any questions, you could either shout it out or put it in the chat room. But that was really a terrific presentation. So when are you going back? Tell us what's next for you.
That's a good question. My initial plan had been to go back late last year, but I had I don't know how old I look, but I actually had a hip replacement and a hamstring surgery, and I've just beat myself up a lot over the years. So I've had some physical hurdles that have been frustrating, would be an understatement. They've held me back, but working hard at rehab, and I will return this year. I don't have definitive plans yet. And if the war ends tomorrow, then I will go back and tell the story of, again, because the story won't end. It'll be far from over. So, and right now, like I said, I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm moving back there this year. So I don't know if anybody has Pittsburgh ties, but yeah. Oh, I see somebody saying they do, Judy.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, everyone's loving the presentation. And we have her email and website there, so you can see more of your work. So how far are you off on your hip replacement?
So the hip replacement was about actually it was 2 years ago, but in November. It's a pretty gnarly injury. My high hamstring actually tore, so like became disconnected from like your butt bone essentially, which makes it very painful to sit, especially on long plane rides. But it's amazing what they can do today. So that was reattached, and just yeah, very much a first world problem, right? So forward to being back out there. I will say that if you do like, first of all, thanks for the generous feedback. I was nervous that after so many Ukraine presentations, I wasn't gonna be able to offer something different, but I also like to write, and I ended up being commissioned to write like a series of stories called Voices of Ukraine for a big market research company, Ipsos. They wanted to be able to they do data collection, and they wanted to be able to put human faces and human stories on data. What's the
name of the company?
Ipsos, IPSOS. They're actually, they're actually huge, and I had never heard of them before this. They were who I got the job with World Bank through.
Right, you said. Yeah.
But I guess I was just going to say I can be happy to share that link if you're interested in reading. Because to me, I mean, to your point about images, like the image must be compelling, but I'd like to think that it would make somebody want to know more. And that's where words come in. And, you know, we relate to each other through individual stories and the details such as names and ages and everything like that. So I enjoy writing as well.
Yeah. And Herb had a question. Is it hard to get your travel plans approved, or is it mostly being a freelancer, you're on your own, you're going, other than access?
Approved by the government or by parents?
I guess being a freelancer, you're approving your own plans. It's only when you get to a border or a crossing, then it becomes, can you get in? And that's where your handler has to help you, right? Yeah.
I mean, there is, I guess based on who I've seen you present, like a lot of my work has been self-initiated, self-funded, at least from the outset. And that's hence the weddings and stuff like that. It's, trust me, I'm not independently wealthy. So a lot of research and planning goes in beforehand, and partnering with different development organizations or NGOs or just groups of volunteers is a good way to get a proverbial foot in the door and to be in situations that I would struggle to be in on my own, as well as with people who know more than I do. So as far as borders, then yes, but like I knew enough to know that I needed certain accreditations and needed to apply for those accreditations well in advance of showing up at the border or the checkpoint. Because you did have to have like an official press accreditation in order to go in. The closer you came to the front line, the more frequently you were stopped, and you had to show a passport and this accreditation.
Terrific. Well, I mean, you really, like I said, you shed light on things that, you know, we only sort of imagine, but really the other hell piece of war, of, you know, people moving, and, you know, the wonderful thing that other people do to make it a little bit tolerable in these other countries to help and to volunteer is really quite humbling, I have to say. It's 'cause we hadn't heard about the Moldavians. We heard about the Polish people being, you know, really wonderful at the borders, but you shed light on another place. So what I'd love for you to do is just give us the last comment of the evening, and so you know you have a standing offer to come back whenever you have new work or another story you want to share. Please just, you know, just ring me up and you're on. You know, so that's a standing offer.
I appreciate that. I guess I just want to thank you all for being here, for like choosing to, I think most of you are on the Eastern Standard Time, so choosing to spend your Friday evening, I think that says a lot. It's good to know people still, you know, are invested in what's happening. So, and I mean, I love hearing from people. So if you ever want to talk shop or similarly, feel free to reach out. So.
Great. Again, thank you so much. And when you go, be careful. You know.
Last thing, Frank, thank you for doing this. I think it's amazing that I don't even think Frank and I have never met, and I didn't realize that he wasn't a photographer. So to know that he's been doing this for 8 years, and like every day this week you've been doing this, so that's quite an investment, and I think a testament to, I don't know, your belief in the importance of this kind of work. So thank you for that.
Yeah, nothing is more important than what you guys do. Yeah, and we all appreciate it very, very much. You know, we don't get a chance to thank you guys face to face enough, but we really appreciate it. So thank you for doing that. And like I say, be careful when you go. And like I said, whenever you'd like to come back, you know, we'd love to have you again. Your work and your presentation was incredibly inspiring and eye-opening, I'm sure, for all of us. So thank you very much. And with that, everybody, thank you so much for being in all week. I really do appreciate that. And you know, unfortunately, we'll be doing this again. You know, we'll do weeks again in probably another month or so. So everyone have a great weekend, and thanks all for coming in. Thank you.